Before we dive into today's incredible tale from the Old West, please hit that like button if you enjoy these stories and subscribe to our channel for more amazing adventures from the frontier. Your support means everything to us and helps us bring you more captivating stories from America's wild past. The dusty streets of Tombstone were never quiet, but on that particular evening in 1882, an unusual silence had settled over the town. The saloons were emptier than usual, and even the most hardened gamblers seemed to have found better places to spend their time. It was the kind of night when trouble brewed beneath the surface. Samuel Morrison had built his reputation as one of the most successful ranchers in Arizona Territory. His cattle empire stretched for miles, and his word was as good as gold in every bank from Phoenix to Tucson. But tonight he found himself in the most uncomfortable situation of his entire life, standing in the back room of Murphy's General Store. The woman before him couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight and eyes that held depths of desperation he'd rarely seen. Her dress, once fine, now showed signs of hard travel and harder times. She clutched a small leather pouch in her trembling hands, and her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Just do it fast." "Please," she said, her words carrying a weight that made Morrison's stomach churn. He had agreed to this meeting after receiving her cryptic message, but now he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The $5 silver she'd mentioned seemed insignificant compared to the gravity of what she was asking. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his boots creaking against the wooden floorboards. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking of me. This whole situation seems mighty peculiar, and I've got to say, it doesn't sit right with my conscience." His weathered hands fidgeted with his hat brim, a nervous habit he'd developed over years of difficult negotiations. The woman's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Morrison. "You don't understand the urgency, Mr. Morrison. Every minute we waste puts more lives at risk. I know how this must look to you, how it must sound, but I'm begging you to trust me. Those 5 coins represent more than money. They represent hope for an entire community." Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the shutters and sending tumbleweeds dancing down the main street. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally making its presence known. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to tap against the window panes with increasing intensity. Morrison studied the woman's face more carefully. There was something familiar about her features, something that nagged at the back of his mind like a half-remembered dream. "Have we met before, miss? Because I've got the strangest feeling that I know you from somewhere, though I can't quite place where or when it might have been." "My name is Catherine Wells," she replied, and Morrison felt his blood run cold. The name hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories he'd tried to bury for nearly a decade. Catherine Wells, the daughter of Judge Henry Wells, the man who had sent Morrison's younger brother to prison on trumped-up charges, where he'd died of consumption within 6 months. Morrison's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but Catherine held up her hand in a gesture of peace. "I know what you're thinking, Mr. Morrison. I know about your brother Thomas. And I know about the injustice my father committed. That's exactly why I'm here tonight. That's why I need your help, and why those 5 coins are so important." The revelation struck Morrison like lightning. This wasn't what he'd expected at all. The cryptic message, the strange meeting location, the desperate plea, none of it was what it seemed. "What exactly are you trying to tell me, Miss Wells? Because right now, I'm more confused than a cat in a doghouse." Catherine reached into her leather pouch and withdrew not $5 silver, but 5 small, intricately carved wooden coins. Each one bore the symbol of a different Native American tribe: Cherokee, Apache, Navajo, Comanche, and Sioux. Morrison had seen similar tokens before, but never all 5 together, and certainly never in the hands of a judge's daughter. "These aren't payment for anything sordid, Mr. Morrison. These are peace tokens, given to my father by 5 different tribal chiefs over the years. Tomorrow morning, representatives from all 5 tribes are meeting in secret to discuss a treaty that could prevent a massive war, but someone has betrayed the location to the army. Morrison's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. You're saying your father is involved in treaty negotiations? Judge Wells, who's spent his career sending Indians to prison or worse? Now, the irony was almost too much to comprehend. The man who had destroyed Morrison's family might actually be trying to prevent a bloodbath. My father has spent the last 3 years of his life trying to make amends for his past mistakes, Catherine continued, her voice gaining strength. He's been secretly working with tribal leaders to find peaceful solutions to the conflicts. But 3 days ago, he suffered a stroke. He's alive, but he can't speak or move. I'm the only one who knows about tomorrow's meeting. The storm outside was intensifying, and the sound of rain against the windows had become a steady drumming. Morrison felt as though he were caught in his own personal tempest, with conflicting emotions and loyalties pulling him in different directions. The desire for revenge against Judge Wells warred with his innate sense of justice and compassion. So, what exactly are you asking me to do? Morrison asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. And why me? Surely there are others who could help you with this situation. But even as he spoke, he realized that his reputation for fairness and his known sympathies for the plight of the displaced tribes made him an obvious choice. Catherine stepped closer, her eyes reflecting both desperation and determination. The meeting is supposed to take place at Devil's Canyon at dawn, but Colonel Whitman's cavalry is planning to surround the area and arrest everyone present. The tribes will think it's a trap, and any chance for peace will be destroyed forever. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people will die in the war that follows. Morrison understood now why time was so critical. If the tribal representatives were captured or killed, their people would assume the worst about white intentions. The fragile trust that Judge Wells had apparently spent years building would be shattered in an instant, and the consequences would be catastrophic for everyone in the territory. But what can I do to stop it? Morrison asked. I'm just one man, and Colonel Whitman has an entire cavalry unit at his disposal. Even if I could reach the meeting site in time, how could I possibly warn everyone and get them to safety before the soldiers arrive? The logistics seemed impossible, especially with the storm making travel treacherous. Catherine smiled for the first time since their conversation began, and Morrison was struck by how much younger and more hopeful she suddenly appeared. That's where your reputation comes in, Mr. Morrison. The tribal leaders know you, and they trust you. Your ranch has been a safe haven for displaced families from multiple tribes over the years. Morrison nodded slowly, remembering the countless times he'd provided food, shelter, or protection to Native American families fleeing persecution or violence. He'd never thought of these actions as particularly heroic. They'd simply seemed like the right thing to do. But apparently, his kindness had not gone unnoticed in the wider community. More importantly, Catherine continued, you know these canyons better than anyone. You could guide the representatives to a new meeting location, somewhere the cavalry would never think to look. My father had identified 3 alternate sites, just in case something like this happened. She pulled out a hand-drawn map from her coat pocket. The map was detailed and precise, showing not only the original meeting location, but also the 3 backup sites Judge Wells had scouted. Morrison recognized all of them. Hidden valleys and secluded canyons where a small group could meet without fear of discovery. The judge had chosen well. Each location was accessible by horseback but invisible from the main trails. But how do you know about Colonel Whitman's plans? Morrison asked. Military operations are usually kept secret, especially ones involving Indian affairs. He studied Catherine's face, looking for any sign of deception or uncertainty. The stakes were too high to proceed on incomplete or inaccurate information. Catherine's expression darkened. Because Colonel Whitman is the one who told me about them. He's been courting me for months, trying to win my father's approval for marriage. He thought he was impressing me by bragging about his upcoming victory against the savage conspirators. He has no idea that I know about my father's real work. The picture was becoming clearer, and Morrison felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. Whitman was using his position and his relationship with Catherine to further his own career, with no regard for the consequences of his actions. It was exactly the kind of abuse of power that Morrison despised, and it made his decision much easier. "So, when you say do it fast," Morrison said, "you mean get to Devil's Canyon before dawn, warn the tribal representatives, and guide them to safety before Whitman's cavalry arrives." The urgency in her voice now made perfect sense. Every minute of delay increased the risk that the peace mission would end in disaster. "Exactly," Catherine replied, "and I need to go with you. I'm the only one who can prove that this isn't a trap, that my father really was trying to help. Without me there to vouch for you, they might think you're leading them into an ambush." She was right, and Morrison knew it. Trust was fragile in the best of circumstances and non-existent when lives were at stake. Morrison looked out at the storm, calculating distances and travel times in his head. The rain would make the journey more difficult, but it would also provide cover from any cavalry patrols. If they left immediately and rode hard, they could reach Devil's Canyon with perhaps an hour to spare before the scheduled meeting time. "This is dangerous, Miss Wells," Morrison warned. "If we're caught, Whitman won't hesitate to brand us as traitors or Indian sympathizers. Your reputation, your future, everything you've worked for could be destroyed." He needed to be sure she understood the full scope of what she was asking, both of him and of herself. Catherine's jaw set in a determined line that reminded Morrison eerily of her father at his most stubborn. "Mr. Morrison, my father spent years making terrible decisions that hurt innocent people. He destroyed families, including yours. If I have a chance to prevent him from being responsible for starting a war, I'm going to take it, regardless of the personal cost." Morrison felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the knot of anger and resentment he'd carried for so many years. Judge Wells might have been a hard man who'd made serious mistakes, but his daughter's courage and determination spoke to a family legacy that went beyond past injustices. Perhaps redemption was possible, even for those who seemed beyond it. "All right, Miss Wells," Morrison said, extending his hand. "I'll help you, but we do this my way, and you follow my lead once we're out there. The canyons can be deadly even in good weather, and this storm is going to make everything 10 times more dangerous." Catherine shook his hand firmly, her grip stronger than he'd expected. They spent the next few minutes reviewing the map and planning their route. Morrison knew a back trail that would avoid the main roads and reduce their chances of encountering cavalry patrols. It was rougher terrain, but it would save them time and keep them hidden from prying eyes. As they prepared to leave, Morrison couldn't help but marvel at the strange turns life could take. A few hours ago, he'd been planning to spend a quiet evening reading by his fireplace. Now he was about to risk everything to help the daughter of the man he'd hated for nearly a decade, all in service of a peace mission that most people would consider impossible. Catherine had changed into riding clothes, practical boots, sturdy pants, and a heavy coat that would protect her from the worst of the weather. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to horseback riding, which was a relief. Morrison had been worried that he'd have to slow his pace to accommodate an inexperienced rider. "One more thing," Catherine said as they prepared to mount their horses. "If something happens to me out there, if we get separated or I'm injured, you have to promise me you'll continue the mission. Those peace tokens aren't just symbols. They represent months of careful negotiation and relationship building. Without this meeting, all of that work will be lost." Morrison nodded solemnly. "You have my word, Miss Wells." But nothing's going to happen to you. I've been riding these canyons for 20 years, and I know every rock and ravine. We'll get there, warn the representatives, and get everyone to safety. Your father's work won't be in vain." He hoped he sounded more confident than he felt. They rode out into the storm, their horses' hooves muffled by the muddy ground. The rain was coming down in sheets now, making visibility poor, but providing excellent cover for their movements. Morrison led the way, following trails that existed more in his memory than in any visible form on the ground. As they rode, Catherine told him more about her father's transformation. The stroke hadn't just affected his body, it had apparently been the culmination of months of guilt and regret over his past actions. He'd begun reaching out to tribal leaders secretly, using his position to gather intelligence about military movements and warn communities of impending raids. "He saved dozens of lives," Catherine shouted over the wind. "Families who might have been caught in surprise attacks, communities that were able to relocate before the cavalry arrived. He never sought recognition or forgiveness. He just tried to do what was right." Morrison found this revelation almost as shocking as everything else that had happened that night. The trail began to climb into the foothills, and Morrison could feel his horse working harder against the steep incline. The storm seemed to be intensifying as they gained elevation, with lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, stark flashes. Each thunderclap seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. "How much further?" Catherine called out, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Morrison checked his pocket watch by the light of the next lightning flash. They'd been riding for 2 hours, which meant they were making good time despite the conditions. Devil's Canyon was still another hour away, but the backup meeting site was only 30 minutes further along the trail. "We're getting close," Morrison replied, "but we need to be extra careful now. This is where we're most likely to encounter cavalry patrols." As if summoned by his words, the sound of horses' hooves could be heard echoing off the canyon walls ahead of them. Morrison quickly guided Catherine off the main trail and into a narrow ravine where they could wait for the patrol to pass. They pressed themselves against the rock wall, their horses snorting nervously as the cavalry unit rode by less than 50 yards away. Morrison counted at least 20 soldiers, all heavily armed and moving with the purposeful efficiency of men on a mission. Colonel Whitman was clearly taking no chances with this operation. Once the patrol had passed, they continued their journey, but Morrison's concern was growing. If Whitman had that many men in the field already, it meant the military operation was larger and more comprehensive than Catherine had initially indicated. The colonel wasn't just planning to arrest the tribal representatives, he was preparing for a potential battle. "Catherine," Morrison said during a brief lull in the storm, "I think we need to consider the possibility that your information about the timing might be wrong. If Whitman has patrols out already, he might be planning to move earlier than dawn." The implications were troubling. If they arrived at Devil's Canyon to find it already surrounded, their mission would become exponentially more dangerous. Catherine's face paled in the moonlight. "You're right. Whitman mentioned something about early deployment, but I assumed he was just being thorough. What if they're already in position?" The thought clearly terrified her, and Morrison could understand why. If the tribal representatives walked into a trap, the resulting bloodshed would be catastrophic. They pushed their horses harder, taking risks on the slippery trail that Morrison would normally never consider. But time was running out, and the stakes were too high for excessive caution. As they crested the ridge overlooking Devil's Canyon, Morrison's worst fears were confirmed. Even through the rain and darkness, he could see the glint of metal and the shadowy forms of soldiers positioned around the canyon rim. "We're too late," Catherine whispered, despair evident in her voice. "They're already here. The tribal representatives will ride right into Whitman's trap, and there's nothing we can do to stop it." But Morrison was studying the scene more carefully, using his knowledge of the terrain to assess their options. "Not necessarily," he said after a moment. Look at how they're positioned. Whitman's focused all his attention on the main approaches to the canyon. But there's a game trail that leads down from the north rim. It's treacherous, but it would allow us to reach the canyon floor without being seen. It was a desperate plan, but it might be their only chance. Catherine followed his gaze and nodded. If we can warn the representatives before they enter the canyon, we can guide them to one of the alternate meeting sites. But we'll have to move fast. Dawn is less than 2 hours away. The eastern horizon was already showing the faintest hint of grey, and Morrison knew that tribal representatives would arrive with the first light. They made their way carefully down the game trail, leading their horses by the reins to avoid making unnecessary noise. Every loose rock that skittered down the slope seemed to echo like a gunshot in the pre-dawn stillness. Morrison's heart pounded as they descended, knowing that discovery would mean certain death or imprisonment. At the canyon floor, they found evidence that others had been there recently. Horse tracks, the remains of a small fire, and other signs that suggested the advance party for the tribal delegation had already scouted the location. This was both encouraging and terrifying. It meant the representatives were indeed coming, but it also meant they might arrive at any moment. Morrison and Catherine positioned themselves near the main entrance to the canyon, hidden behind a cluster of boulders that would provide both concealment and a clear view of approaching riders. Now came the hardest part, waiting and hoping they wouldn't be too late to prevent a disaster that could change the course of history in the American Southwest. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the storm clouds, Morrison heard the sound they'd been waiting for, the soft drumming of unshod hooves on wet earth. The tribal representatives were approaching, completely unaware of the military trap that awaited them. Everything now depended on timing, courage, and a little bit of luck. The lead rider came into view first, a tall man on a paint horse, wearing traditional Apache clothing but carrying modern weapons. Behind him rode 4 other men, each representing a different tribe, as evidenced by their distinctive dress and horse decorations. They moved with the quiet confidence of experienced warriors, but Morrison could see they were relaxed, expecting a peaceful meeting. Morrison stepped out from behind the boulder, his hands raised in the universal gesture of peace. "Stop!" he called out in a voice that was firm but not threatening. "I'm Samuel Morrison. You're riding into a military trap. Colonel Whitman has soldiers positioned all around this canyon." The lead rider's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but he didn't draw. "How do we know you speak truth?" the Apache representative asked in accented but clear English. "Many times, white man says one thing, does another. Why should we trust you?" It was a fair question, and Morrison knew that his answer could determine whether these 5 men lived or died in the next few minutes. Catherine stepped forward, and Morrison saw recognition flash in the eyes of several representatives. "I am Catherine Wells, daughter of Judge Henry Wells. My father cannot be here because of illness, but he sent these tokens as proof of his commitment to peace." She held up the 5 carved wooden coins, and the change in the men's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The Apache leader dismounted and approached Catherine, examining the tokens carefully. "Judge Wells gave these to our chiefs as pledge of good faith. If his daughter carries them, then perhaps the spirits have sent help when we need it most." He looked at Morrison with new respect. "Samuel Morrison, yes, we know this name, friend to the people, protector of the displaced." Morrison felt a surge of relief. "There's no time to explain everything, but I can guide you to a safe meeting place where you can conduct your negotiations without fear of military interference. The alternate location is about an hour's ride from here, in a hidden valley that the soldiers will never find." The representatives exchanged glances, and Morrison could see them weighing their options. "But how do we know this is not elaborate trap?" asked the Navajo representative. "Perhaps you work with soldiers, use daughter of judge to gain our trust." Morrison understood their skepticism. In their position, he would be equally suspicious of such a convenient rescue. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford in such dangerous circumstances. Catherine removed a letter from her coat. Her father's final message, written in his shaking hand just days before his stroke. "My father wrote this for the meeting. It contains details that only he and your chiefs would know. Specific promises made, agreements reached, plans for the future. No one else could have written this." She handed the letter to the Apache leader. As the man read, his expression gradually changed from suspicion to amazement. This is true writing of Judge Wells. He mentions words spoken by my chief in private, promises made with no other white men present. This daughter speaks truth. The other representatives crowded around to examine the letter, and Morrison could see their doubts dissolving. But time was running short. The sky was growing lighter, and Morrison knew that Whitman's soldiers would soon realize that their trap had failed. When that happened, they would begin searching the surrounding area, and a group of 6 people with horses would be difficult to hide. They needed to be well away from Devil's Canyon before the hunt began. "We must go now," Morrison urged. "Every minute we delay increases the danger for all of us. I know a route that will keep us hidden from the cavalry, but we need to move while we still have darkness to cover our movements." The representatives nodded and began mounting their horses, their earlier suspicions replaced by urgent purpose. The journey to the alternate meeting site took them through terrain that few white men had ever seen. Narrow canyons, hidden passes, and secret valleys that had been used by various tribes for centuries as refuge and meeting places. Morrison marveled at how Judge Wells had learned about these locations, and he began to understand the depth of the man's commitment to his peace mission. As they rode, the storm began to clear, and shafts of sunlight started breaking through the clouds. The landscape revealed itself in all its rugged beauty, red rock formations that seemed to glow within a fire, ancient petroglyphs that told stories older than written history, and vistas that stretched to the horizon in every direction. "Your father chose this place well," Morrison told Catherine as they entered the hidden valley that would serve as their meeting location. It was perfectly defensible, with only one narrow entrance that could be easily watched, and it was large enough to accommodate the horses and riders comfortably. Most importantly, it was completely invisible from any of the main trails. The representatives dismounted and began preparing for their delayed meeting. Despite everything that had happened, they seemed remarkably calm and focused. Morrison realized that these were men who had lived their entire lives with danger and uncertainty. An unexpected military trap was just another challenge to be overcome, not a cause for panic or despair. Catherine approached Morrison as the men began their discussions. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done today. You risked everything to help people you barely knew, and you had every reason to refuse after what my father did to your family." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and Morrison could see the emotional toll the night had taken on her. "Your father may have made mistakes in the past," Morrison replied, "but what he was trying to do here. This could prevent a war that would destroy thousands of lives. That's worth risking everything for." He paused, looking out over the valley, where 5 representatives from different tribes were working together toward a common goal of peace. "Besides, I think your brother would have approved." The meeting lasted for 3 hours, and Morrison was amazed by the complexity and sophistication of the negotiations. These men weren't the savage warriors that military propaganda portrayed. They were experienced diplomats, skilled negotiators, and visionary leaders who understood that the old ways of life were changing and that adaptation was necessary for survival. By midday, they had reached agreements on territorial boundaries, resource sharing, dispute resolution mechanisms, and protocols for future negotiations. Most importantly, they had established a communication network that would allow the different tribes to coordinate their responses to military actions and avoid being played against each other by unscrupulous officials. As the representatives prepared to depart, each one approached Morrison personally to express their gratitude. "You have shown that not all white men seek our destruction," the Cherokee representative said. "This will be remembered, and your name will be spoken with honor in our councils." Morrison felt humbled by their words and by the trust they had placed in him. The Apache leader was the last to speak. "Judge Wells chose his messenger well. His daughter has courage of a warrior and wisdom of a peace chief. If more white leaders had such advisors, perhaps our peoples could find a way to share this land without bloodshed." Catherine blushed at the praise, but Morrison could see how much it meant to her. As they watched the representatives ride away in different directions, Morrison and Catherine finally had a moment to process everything that had happened. In less than 12 hours, they had prevented a potential massacre, facilitated a historic peace negotiation, and possibly changed the course of relations between the U.S. government and Native American tribes in the Southwest. "What happens now?" Catherine asked. "When Colonel Whitman realizes his trap failed, he's going to be furious. He'll want to know how the tribal representatives were warned, and it won't take him long to figure out that someone with inside information was involved." The question of consequences was indeed sobering, and Morrison knew they would both face difficult times ahead. "We'll deal with that when it comes," Morrison replied. "Right now, the important thing is that 5 tribes have agreed to work together for peace, instead of being tricked into a war that would have benefited no one except ambitious military officers and corrupt officials." He looked at Catherine with newfound respect. "Your father would be proud of what you accomplished today." As they began their journey back to Tombstone, Morrison reflected on the strange events that had brought him to this moment. A cryptic message from the daughter of his enemy had led to one of the most important experiences of his life. He had discovered that redemption was possible, that enemies could become allies, and that sometimes the most unlikely people could change the course of history. The ride back was quiet, both of them exhausted by the night's adventures, but also exhilarated by what they had accomplished. The storm had passed completely, leaving the desert landscape washed clean and sparkling in the afternoon sun. It seemed appropriate somehow, a fresh start after a night of revelation and transformation. When they finally reached the outskirts of Tombstone, Catherine turned to Morrison one last time. "I want you to know that what happened between my father and your brother, he regretted it every day for the rest of his life. The stroke, the guilt, the desperate attempt to make amends, it all stemmed from the knowledge that he had failed to live up to his own principles when it mattered most." Morrison nodded, feeling the last of his old anger finally drain away. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us who we really are inside," he said. "Your father found his way back to doing what was right, and you've shown that his legacy doesn't have to be defined by his worst mistakes. That's more than most people ever manage to accomplish." As they parted ways in town, Morrison knew that this was not the end of their story, but rather the beginning. The peace agreements negotiated in the Hidden Valley would need to be implemented and protected. There would be other Colonel Whitmans who would try to sabotage the process for their own gain. And there would be other desperate situations that would require courage, wisdom, and the willingness to risk everything for what was right. But for now, Morrison was content to return to his ranch, knowing that he had played a part in something larger than himself. The 5 wooden coins Catherine had carried were symbols of hope and possibility, proof that even in the harsh landscape of the American frontier, peace was possible if people of goodwill were willing to work together and take risks for the common good. That evening, as Morrison sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, he thought about the lesson of that extraordinary day. Sometimes what appears to be a request for something shameful or degrading is actually a desperate plea for help in accomplishing something noble and heroic. Sometimes our enemies' children carry the seeds of redemption that can heal old wounds and create new possibilities. And sometimes when a woman says, "Just do it fast, please," she's not asking for what you think she's asking for at all. She's asking you to help her save lives, prevent a war, and change the course of history. The real question is whether you're brave enough to say yes when destiny comes calling, even when it comes in a form you never expected. What do you think would have happened if Samuel Morrison had refused to help Catherine that night? Do you believe people can truly change and make amends for their past mistakes, like Judge Wells tried to do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this incredible tale of redemption and courage from the Old West.